You know how everyone's always complaining about like those long election lines and, those hanging chads?
Oh, yeah.
Well, imagine like a whole election where they couldn't figure out who won for months.
Right. Yeah.
The whole thing just ends in these like backroom deals that totally change the country.
It's amazing how much some things really never change, right? The
Yeah,
election of 1876
exactly.
makes our modern day voting problems look pretty tame.
Totally. So today we're diving deep into the 1876 election.
Mm-hmm.
This crazy political showdown that basically split the country in two.
Yeah.
And we'll look at the compromise of 1877 that tried to fix things.
Right.
But it definitely left some like deep scars on the nation.
Absolutely.
And get this, we're also going to uncover the story behind Jim Crow.
Okay.
This name that started as a stage act and then somehow became like the symbol for a whole era of segregation.
It's wild.
It's a wild story.
This election wasn't just about picking a president. It was about like the very soul of the nation, the future of Reconstruction.
And ultimately, who held the power in the South?
Okay, so to set the scene, we're just a little over a decade out from the Civil War. It's 1876, and America's still kind of figuring out how to put itself back together.
Yeah.
Reconstruction is in full swing,
Right.
but honestly, it's a pretty messy and controversial process.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. You have these former Confederate states
Right.
trying to rejoin the Union.
Yeah.
You have former slaves trying to find their rightful place in society. And then you have the North trying to enforce all these radical changes in the South.
Yeah, it was basically a recipe for conflict right from the start.
Totally. And then on top of all that, you've got these three new constitutional amendments.
Right.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th.
Yeah, okay.
Promising freedom, citizenship, and voting rights for Black Americans.
Huge changes.
But those promises face some serious pushback, especially in the South.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about like Southern whites resisting these changes.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
They wanted to hold on to the old ways,
Uh-huh.
the old power structures.
Yeah.
And they weren't giving them up easily.
Definitely not. That's when you see groups like the Ku Klux Klan rising up, using violence and intimidation to undermine Black rights and, keep white supremacy in place.
It was a dangerous time.
So Reconstruction was basically having this like major identity crisis.
Yeah.
You had some people pushing for reconciliation,
Right.
others clinging to white supremacy,
Uh-huh.
and still others demanding true equality for everyone.
It was like a powder keg waiting to explode.
And then in the early 1870s, things start to shift in the North.
Yeah.
Like that initial enthusiasm for Reconstruction
Right.
starts to fade.
Mm.
The panic of 1873 hits this like major economic depression.
Right.
And suddenly domestic issues are taking center stage.
People were tired of the fighting,
Yeah.
tired of the cost of Reconstruction.
Both financially and emotionally, right?
Absolutely. It's like everyone was just saying, can't we all just get along?
And that weariness, that desire to just move on,
Yeah.
even if it meant ignoring some huge problems.
Exactly.
Well, that created like the perfect setup for the 1876 election to become this epic showdown.
It really did.
Okay, so let's meet our contenders in this political boxing match.
Okay.
In one corner, we've got Rutherford B. Hayes.
The Republican nominee.
Yeah, a Civil War general and a strong supporter of Reconstruction.
Uh-huh.
And in the other corner, representing the Democrats, we've got Samuel J. Tilden,
Right.
a New York governor known for being against corruption.
And right away, it was a tight race.
Yeah.
Both candidates were campaigning hard,
Mm.
but it was clear that this election was about way more than just their platforms.
Totally.
It was a referendum on Reconstruction itself.
And when the results came in, let's just say they weren't exactly clear-cut.
Not at all. Tilden won the popular vote,
Okay.
but the Electoral College, that's where things got complicated.
Oh, boy.
4 states, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and surprisingly, Oregon,
Okay.
all had disputed results.
So what went wrong?
Everything.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking allegations of voter fraud, intimidation, missing ballots, you name it. 20 electoral votes were up in the air,
Uh-huh.
and whoever got those votes would win the presidency.
Talk about a nail-biter.
Yeah.
So how did they even start to untangle this mess?
Well, they tried to come up with a solution,
Okay.
and it wasn't pretty. Congress formed a special electoral commission
Okay.
to figure out who deserved those disputed votes.
Makes sense.
But here's the thing. The commission was made up of lawmakers from both parties,
Uh-oh.
along with some Supreme Court justices.
Okay.
And it became pretty clear that this wasn't going to be an unbiased decision.
Shocker politics getting in the way of, well, politics.
What else is new?
So who ended up coming out on top?
Well, the Republicans had a slim majority on the commission,
Okay.
and after a ton of debate, and let's be honest, probably some backroom deals,
Yeah.
they gave all 20 of those disputed electoral votes to Hayes.
Wow.
Just like that he was declared the winner. The Democrats were furious.
Yeah, I bet.
They said the election was stolen.
Right.
And the country was like on the verge of another civil war.
It sounds like utter chaos.
It was.
So we've got these tensions sky high.
Yeah.
Democrats are angry. The country's divided. Everyone's wondering if this whole democracy thing is going to fall apart.
Right.
And then comes the Compromise of 1877.
Enter the compromise.
It sounds so peaceful.
Yeah, right.
But something tells me it wasn't so simple.
It was a bunch of secret meetings,
Okay.
mostly at the Wormley Hotel in Washington, D.C.,
Interesting.
which is kind of ironic because it was owned by an African-American.
Oh, wow.
Republican leaders just wanted to avoid another crisis.
I see.
So they basically cut a deal with the Southern Democrats.
To make this whole election mess go away?
Exactly.
Okay, so what kind of deal are we talking about here?
It was like a political barter session.
Okay, I like it.
The Republicans were willing to give up a lot
Huh?
just to make sure Hayes stayed president.
And keep the peace.
And keep the peace.
Yes.
So in exchange for accepting Hayes as president, the Southern Democrats had some demands.
I bet those demands are pretty steep.
The biggest one was removing all federal troops from the South.
Wow.
Which was a huge deal.
Yeah.
It meant the end of Reconstruction.
So basically the South could govern itself again,
That's exactly what it meant.
which, knowing what we know, doesn't sound great for racial equality.
Not really. The Republicans traded away the protection of black Southerners.
Just for some political stability.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow.
What a compromise.
It gets even more interesting.
Oh, boy.
The Southern Democrats also wanted a spot in Hayes's cabinet,
Okay.
like a key position for a Southern Democrat.
To have some say in the new administration.
Yep. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Right?
It seems like this wasn't just about moving on to the election.
Nope.
This was about power.
Absolutely. And don't forget about the money.
Oh, right. What about the economic angle?
The Southern Democrats wanted federal funding for infrastructure projects.
Like railroads, canals, that sort of thing.
Exactly. They wanted to boost the South's economy after the war, and they saw this compromise as their chance to get that sweet federal cash.
So they got to end Reconstruction.
Mm.
They got a seat at the political table, and they got some big economic benefits.
Yeah.
What did the Republicans even get out of this?
Well, on the surface, they got a Republican president,
Mm-hmm.
and they avoided another constitutional crisis.
Which wasn't a small thing.
Right.
Right.
But the long-term consequences were a whole other story.
I have a feeling we're about to get into those consequences right now.
We are.
Okay, so we've got this shady deal, a new president, and the South basically gets to do whatever it wants.
Yeah.
And where does Jim Crow fit into all of this?
Right. How did a stage performer's name become the symbol for racial segregation?
This is the part that really gets me.
It's a bizarre story, almost unbelievable, actually.
Okay, well, I'm yours.
The name Jim Crow comes from this white performer named Thomas Dartmouth Rice.
Okay.
Back in the 1830s, he had this crazy popular act, a blackface minstrel show.
A minstrel show. You mean like with the over-the-top costumes and the offensive makeup?
Yeah, the whole thing.
Wow.
Rice called his act Jump Jim Crow, and it became a national sensation.
I can't believe that was a thing.
But it wasn't just entertainment. It was a way to spread these really harmful stereotypes about black people.
So it reinforced these terrible ideas that were already out there.
Exactly.
So this stage name, Jim Crow, went from a song and dance routine to a symbol of racial oppression.
It's a strange journey, right?
Yeah, that's a plot twist I wasn't expecting.
This seemingly harmless name turned into a racial slur.
Okay.
And then after the Compromise of 1877, these discriminatory laws started appearing all over the South.
And the name just stuck.
It did.
So the Compromise didn't actually mention Jim Crow, but it's like it created the perfect environment for those laws to take hold.
That's a good way to put it. Think about it. The federal troops are gone.
Right.
Reconstruction is over.
Mm-hmm.
And Southern white leaders are ready to take back their power. They basically had free rein to reverse any progress made on racial equality.
And Jim Crow laws became their tools for doing that.
Exactly.
But I thought the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law.
It did.
So how could they just ignore that?
Well, the Supreme Court at that time wasn't exactly a champion of racial equality.
Oh, boy.
They basically looked the other way and let these discriminatory laws stand.
That's awful.
It was a betrayal of everything Reconstruction was supposed to achieve.
So we've got this shady compromise. The name Jim Crow takes on a whole new meaning. What happens next? What does this actually look like for people in the South?
Well, if the compromise was the opening act, Jim Crow was the main event.
And a long and brutal one.
Exactly. Imagine a world where you can't vote,
No.
you can't go to decent schools or hospitals,
Okay.
and you're forced to live in separate, often terrible communities.
That was the reality for Black Americans under Jim Crow.
It was a dark chapter in American history, and it wasn't just about separating the races.
Really?
It was about making sure white people stayed in control.
Like a system of white supremacy.
Exactly, where Black people were treated like second-class citizens.
Stripped of their basic rights.
And their dignity. It was a terrible time.
It's tough to imagine living in a society so focused on separating people because of their race.
It's like they wanted to create two completely different worlds.
And that was the whole point, right?
Absolutely. These laws were all about keeping white people on top.
In charge, politically and socially.
Yep. They used laws, social customs, even violence to enforce segregation.
So after this compromise, what happened? Did anyone try to fight back?
Oh, yeah, of course. Black communities never stopped fighting for their rights.
That's good to hear.
There were brave people and organizations challenging these laws in court, organizing protests, demanding equality.
It sounds like an uphill battle.
It was, especially with the federal government ignoring the problem.
Right.
And the Supreme Court supporting separate but equal.
It's like the Compromise of 1877 just shut the door on Reconstruction.
In a lot of ways it did. It was a turning point in American history, a
Yeah.
step back from the ideals of racial equality.
The ideals that people fought so hard for during the Civil War.
Exactly. It was a win for politics, but a huge loss for Black Americans.
So what can we learn from all of this? It happened over 100 years ago, but it feels like these issues are still relevant today.
It shows us that progress isn't always a straight line.
Yeah.
It's a warning about what can happen when we compromise our values.
When we prioritize short-term gains over doing what's right.
Exactly. And it reminds us how deep-rooted these ideas about race and power really are.
And how easily those ideas can be used to keep inequality in place.
That's a good point. We need to understand our history,
Even the uncomfortable parts.
especially the uncomfortable parts, so we can learn from our mistakes and create a better future.
It seems like we're still dealing with the consequences of that compromise today.
In a way, we are. The fight for racial justice didn't end in 1877.
It's still going on.
It is, and we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
I agree.
It shows us that we can't just ignore the past.
We need to understand it,
It's part of who we are.
and it's crucial to building a better future.
I hope this deep dive into the 1876 election and the compromise of 1877 has given you some new insights.
Me too.
Maybe even sparked some outrage.
Because sometimes a little outrage is what we need to keep fighting for a more just world.
Thanks for joining us and keep diving deep.